Hello and welcome to the Pastor Well podcast. This is Hershael York, the Dean of the School of Theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm also the senior pastor of the Buckron Baptist Church in Frankfort. The Pastor Well podcast is a podcast dedicated to helping those who serve the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ be faithful in their ministry. And today we are especially honored, delighted, privileged to have Dr. D.A. Carson with us, and we're going to be talking about preaching, theology, and the ministry that he's had that has helped so many pastor well. Dr. Carson, it is a joy to have you. Welcome to the campus of Southern Seminary and to the Pastor Well podcast.
It's my privilege and honor to be with you.
Well, I approach this with fear and trembling. You have no idea how large you loom in my own thinking and heart and mind, my own walk with the Lord.
I'm ashamed to say that I have the gift of intimidation.
Well, it is because you have been used so greatly of the Lord, and you really are a spiritual giant in so many ways. God has used you greatly. So I've got to tell you I have two D.A. Carson stories, basically, that I want to relate to you. The first one is, doesn't involve meeting you personally in any way, but your book, I bet you would be shocked to know which of your books I would put in the top 5 most formative books in my lifetime. Of all the books that have influenced me, I doubt you would guess which one of yours it would be. But it is, you ready for it? Exegetical Fallacies.
Oh, my.
Now, you wrote that late 80s, early 90s, somewhere there?
A long time ago.
Yeah, late 70s, early 80s. Yes. I got the wrong decade there because I was in my early 20s when I read it. I had grown up in an independent Baptist background, and we were very biblical. I mean, I was taught the Bible. My dad was a pastor. A lot of the preaching that I heard in the circle that I grew up in was what I call nifty-lifty preaching. They would find a line that was sort of poetic, a turn of phrase, and lift it out of its context, and then use that line really as a window to pour in their own systematic theology. And that's what I had grown up with. And it was often very true what was said, but it was not very textual. I also had grown up on so-called word study sermons, hearing huperetes, under rower. Timothy was Paul's under rower, and the gospel was the dynamite of salvation and all those things. So I'd grown up with this. When I read Exegetical Fallacies, coupled with, around the same time, I read Stott's Between Two Worlds.
Oh, yes.
Those two books revolutionized my understanding of preaching. About the same time, somewhere in there, I also read Walt Kaiser's Toward an Exegetical Theology. And these 3 books truly transformed my understanding of the Scripture. They made me want to know the Scripture more. It was largely through Exegetical Fallacies that I decided I wanted to pursue the study of Greek. I did 4 years of undergraduate Greek at the University of Kentucky. I did a master's in Greek at the University of Kentucky in classical Greek, but it was Exegetical Fallacies that really inspired me. So I just want to say thank you. That little book showed me the importance of the text. God used it greatly in my life. It's still in print. It's still transforming preaching, I believe, and I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you. All of us stand on the shoulders of others in one fashion or another, and I'm profoundly grateful to God if that book was a step in your own pilgrimage.
It was a truly important step, and I remember you even corrected yourself in that book.
In the second edition.
Yeah. You showed how, I believe, some graduate student of yours,
yes.
I believe in the discussion of the water and being born of the water and the Spirit.
John 3.
Mm-hmm. And you showed how you had been wrong, and I believe a graduate student of yours.
Yes, Linda Belleville.
Yeah, corrected you. And that was noteworthy to me on so many levels. I mean, this many years later, I still remember that very distinctly. My other story that involves you was, so my boys, I have two sons, when they turned 11, I told each of them, I'll take you anywhere in the United States you want to go for a trip with just you and Dad. When they were 16, it was anywhere in the world. My oldest son, Michael, who's now a pastor in Missouri, when he was 11, where do you want to go, Michael? Michael wanted to go to Chicago. He wanted to see Wheaton College. He wanted to see Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He wanted to go to the Shedd Aquarium and the Natural History Museum. And so we did. In 1994, we went to Chicago for his 11-year-old trip, the two of us. We made our way to Trinity Seminary, where my erstwhile professor, later would be my colleague here at Southern Seminary, Tom Nettles, was on faculty with you.
Yes. Great man.
And I went to see Tom. Michael and I went there, and I said, can you introduce me to D.A. Carson? And he did. So that's the first time I met you, along with my 11-year-old son, who's now almost 36 years old and a pastor. And it was a luminary moment for both of us.
I have to ask, what kind of input went into an 11-year-old boy who wanted to see a seminary at that age?
Well, he was always focused. He had trusted the Lord at a very young age, and he read widely. He's very much, still to this day, a theologian. He thinks a lot about the Scriptures, and he's read most of your books. I've failed to say that when we talk about the number of your books, it's rather large. I'm going to ask you, do you know how many books you've written?
Not exactly. It's
depends on how you count, doesn't it?
It does. Books where I'm either the author or the primary editor is something over 60, but I don't know how many. But then I've edited in 3 series about another 80 books. The New Studies in Biblical Theology, the Pillar series, and Studies in Biblical Greek. So those begin to accumulate as well.
That's astounding. Do you find it hard to edit the work of others? Is it easier to write things yourself than it is to edit the work of others? What's the difference?
It depends who the others are. There's some things I edit that are extremely well done, and it's a privilege to edit them, and I'm learning from them all the time. And there are others that basically have to be rewritten. It would have been easier just to write it myself. So it varies across the spectrum.
We're not going to ask you to name any names.
I won't provide any either.
According to Tim Challies, he counted 62 books, 257 articles, 115 reviews. That's a lot of output. Now, you've spent 40 years at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And I just ask, as you look back over that, has it been hard to stay at one place for all that time?
No. In the life of any institution, there are challenges that come along that make the grass on the other side of the fence look greener. But whether in the local church or in an institution, I'm biased toward long ministries. Mm-hmm. I think that they produce more good on the long haul. Every time you make a major move, you lose 6 months of your life in any case, just in the logistics. And if you're teaching at a really good seminary, and Trinity is a good seminary, what precisely is the sense of strategy or wisdom in going to another seminary, unless you were going to one that was really quite poor, where you thought you could help it out, or something of that order.
Right.
The only exception is I have sometimes wondered if I should leave the seminary and return to pastoral ministry. I began in church planting and in pastoral ministry in Canada, and there is a part of me that would have liked to return, but some revered friends warned me off. They told me that they thought that my ministry was really properly bound up with training more ministers, and so I didn't want to become the sort of faculty member who is busy training people to become faculty members. Mm-hmm. If I was going to be a faculty member at a graduate seminary, I wanted to be the kind of faculty member who was training people to think highly of local church ministry. And what has pleased me as much as anything in the last few years is the number of PhD students who are pastoring churches or doing ministry of that sort today, rather than opting for the teaching slots that most of them could have found.
And the untold number of pastors that you never had in a classroom and you will never meet, but who have read your works of exegesis and encouragement and have taken what you've done and put it in the pulpit, into the lives of countless faces you'll only see in heaven. That's got to be a remarkable feeling.
It is encouraging, but at the same time, I'm realistic enough to remember that I myself am the product of people that I've read. Calvin is still influencing me. Jim Packer is still influencing me. John Stott still influencing me, and many, many, many others. And at a personal level, if the Lord tarries 200 years, nobody's going to be talking about Don Carson.
That's right.
They're going to be talking about Jesus Christ.
That's
so
right.
It's important to put those things in a certain kind of perspective and not pat ourselves on the back. It's been a privilege to do the little bit that God has given me to do.
And you grew up in a pastor's home?
Yes. Dad was a church planter. He was born in Northern Ireland. My mother was born in England. They met in Canada, and both of them had this English background. But Dad felt constrained to plant churches in French Canada, which at the time meant largely the province of Quebec, which was strong majority French, some parts all French, and very, very strongly and traditionally Catholic. And there had been 70 or 80 evangelical churches in a population of 6 or 6.5 million, but they had died out because of liberalism. There weren't more than 5 or 6
really
Baptist churches and another half dozen Brethren churches. That was it when my dad and another chap from Switzerland started going in the 1930s. And in late 30s, and eventually Dad got his theological training in Toronto, and then took an English language church in a part of Montreal, Emmanuel Baptist Church in Verdun, with the understanding that he'd be there for 5 years while he was learning the French language. It was one of the few English churches, so he was pastoring an English church while learning the French language better. And then he planted a church in Montreal in French after that.
Really?
And that was in the 40s. And I was born in 46. And in 48, then Dad moved to another city and was working in another church, that one bilingual. So all his life, he served small churches. The situation in French Canada was hard then. Baptist ministers alone, between 50 and 52, spent a total of 8 years in jail. People
Wow.
don't know that history.
No, I was totally unaware.
Yeah, for disturbing the peace, the charges were, or inciting to riot, or whatever.
Because of the influence of Catholicism.
Oh yes, at the time, it was medieval. Yeah. And
my dad was a missionary in Brazil, and it was much the same thing there.
Yeah. And we kids were sometimes beaten up because we were maudits protestants, damn Protestants. Now, it's not like that today.
Right.
Quebec in those days was so medieval in its outlook, in its form of Catholicism, that the average family had 8 kids. And a priest spoke of la revanche de la crèche, la revanche du berceau, the revenge of the cradle, by which they meant we'll overpopulate you and gain back control of Canada. It had the highest birth rate and the lowest abortion rate of anywhere in North America. Today, Quebec is so secular, it's got the highest abortion rate and the lowest birth rate of any place in North America. So it's a different animal today from when I grew up. But that was the shape of things. So all of his life, Dad never served a church with more than about 40 people. Toward the end of his life, a movement of God really came through. And he would sometimes speak to 50, 60, 70, 80 people. But that was it. He was not a conference speaker. He was not a writer. All of his ministry was faithfulness in small contexts where there was a lot of opposition.
You grew up hearing his preaching primarily.
Yes.
And you came to know Christ at what age?
Oh, that's a good question that is hard to answer.
I understand.
It was either when I was
anxious to hear your answer.
Yeah, it was either when I was 8, almost 9, at a Baptist conference in Muskoka in Ontario. There was a preacher by the name of Sam Michalowski who set out the gospel, and even though I was very young, convinced me I was a sinner and needed forgiveness, and I knelt down by my bed and asked Christ into my life. And it might well be that that's when I was converted. But it's also possible that I was being socialized into the faith of my parents without being genuinely converted. So I don't know if it was then or in the second year at university, at McGill University, when I was studying chemistry, that I was converted. So I have a mental checklist of things to ask God. And one of them is, when did you save me?
At what point did regeneration occur?
That's right.
Yeah.
And if I ask him more generically, when did you save me, he will probably smile and say, from before the foundation of the world, my son.
Well, that is a good answer. So was it your father's preaching that shaped you? Were you listening to other preachers?
Not really. Until I left home at 16 to go to university. And so then it was other preachers. But up to that point, the only preacher I heard in English and French was my dad. Dad was a textual expositor who stayed rigorously close to the biblical text, an inerrantist, conservative, but he was not a systemic thinker. He was not a systematician. He would sometimes be persuaded by what he read about some new movement coming through, but he was so textually picky that he would self-correct. He would self-correct not because he had access to really excellent educational things in Quebec, but because he just kept reading his Bible. I have his journals, and they're full of Bible quotations in English, in French, in Greek, and sometimes in Hebrew, which he kept up all the days of his life.
Oh, so he knew Greek and Hebrew.
Oh, he went to seminary.
He did.
And so his Greek was better than his Hebrew, but yes, and he kept them up all his life.
Well, now, this is astounding to me because basically what you did continued the trajectory of your own father.
Yes.
And you just became deeper in the Greek and the Hebrew and the seminary training. And
yes, but in all fairness, it wasn't a straight line. When I went to university, I studied chemistry and mathematics and almost studied English instead, but I stayed on the chemistry side. And I intended to do a PhD in organic synthesis. I had hoped to go to Cornell, believe it or not. And then through a number of things, the Lord called me to the ministry instead. And so I left that side of things and went to a small seminary in Toronto and started theological training, did an MDiv, and then planted a church or two and pastored another on the west coast of Canada before going to Cambridge for doctoral studies. So it wasn't that I had wanted to be like Dad all my life.
I understand.
I was virtually finished 4 years away from home in a science degree before the Lord began shoveling me toward pastoral ministry.
But how precious that the seeds that were planted there.
Oh, that's true.
Or what bore fruit later in life. That was in a sense my story too. It wasn't a straight line, but my dad's influence on my life is massive, and just the faithful preaching of the word and pointing me to Christ, giving me a love for the scriptures above all else. That's the thing that I've carried with me through life that I really got from my dad.
And also, in all fairness, my father's prayer life was remarkable. I can't remember a day when he didn't spend at least 45 minutes kneeling before his office chair, praying. He was an old-fashioned intercessor, and in all fairness, I don't want to put it all on my dad. My mom, who's to say these things, but my mom was a nurse, but she also went to seminary, and she was probably a better student than Dad was, and Dad exemplified things in public, but Mom was a very wise head in private. I can remember many, many times talking things over with her when I was a kid or a teenager. So it was the two of them together.
Yeah. The lines are falling to you in pleasant
that's
places. That's correct. What a blessing. Well, how did you develop your view of what preaching is? Like you would say that you believe expository preaching is the correct form of preaching?
Yes.
Do you have a definition of expository preaching?
Yes, but it's a bit sophisticated.
Okay, because mine is exactly the opposite. It's very, very simple.
Well, the simple form is it's unpacking what's actually there in the text. Simple as that. That's expository preaching. But that is indifferentiable from faithful textual preaching or from even faithful topical preaching. Eventually, I want to say some other things about it. It's the kind of verbal exposition of what is there in the Word of God in such a way that, and then I fill in a number of things. And one of the things that I like to fill in that is sometimes missing from expository definitions is that ideally it's the kind of explanation of text that when you butt up against one of the inner canonical trajectories, the biblical theological lines, it wisely travels up and down that line to show you where it comes from and how it ends up with Jesus. So temple, covenant, priesthood, kingdom, about 20, 25 of the biggies, 70 or so smaller ones, that I think that good expository preaching, when it butts up against these things, takes time, not every time, but often enough to draw the canonical tendons, the ligaments, to show how the biblical storyline hangs together. Because to do that teaches people how to read the Bible as a whole.
That's the thing right there. You're not only explaining the text, you're teaching people how to handle the text themselves.
Correct.
You're discipling them to read and understand the Bible.
And primarily the text at hand, but in such a way that you're teaching people how the text at hand relates to the broader canon.
You're giving them a lens.
Yeah, that's right.
That's exactly correct. Now, you're not saying that a preacher must do this in every sermon.
No, it would get very boring.
Right, but that he's hanging this framework.
Correct.
Well, thou art not far from the kingdom. I agree with you wholeheartedly. One of the things that I've heard you say before in another conversation is, like in difficult texts, say in the Old Testament, let's take Joshua 8, which is the Joshua's attack on the city of Ai, and God here, this is after they've been defeated, and now God gives them a military strategy. They put rear guard behind, and then the attack from the front. The inhabitants come out and pursue the army, and then they catch them between the two Israeli divisions and crush them, go into the town, kill everybody, then bring out the king, kill him, hang him on a tree till evening, and put him under a pile of rocks. Now, the modern mind looks at that and says, "What kind of a God is this? Who would order?" They'll use the word genocide. Here's the genocide at Ai, and a lot of Christians would be afraid to go near a text like that. You say we should not run from it, but we should run toward the wrath of God. Is that right?
Yeah. Let me put it in a broader framework first. It is always a mistake to preach the Bible apologetically, in the modern sense of apologetically. That is to say something like, in this text, Jesus talks about hell. Quite frankly, I don't like the topic. I'd rather do without it. But, we're going through the book of Matthew, and it's the next text, so I have to say something about it. And so we'll do what we can.
Right.
To say that sort of thing is basically to say, I'm gentler and kinder than Jesus.
That's right. I'm sitting in judgment on God.
That's correct. So there's a sense in which the preacher's job is to understand the text and then make God's point of view as convincing as possible. Not to apologize for it, but to unpack it in such a way that it makes sense within the canon. It's coherent. It's reasonable, and even on the long haul, canonically winsome. And so on things like wrath passages and genocide passages, I want to fight against the common misperception that the picture of God in the Old Testament is of a pretty harsh boogeyman, And when you get to Jesus, it's gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look upon a little child. It's wrong textually because in the Old Testament there are many, many passages that say things like, he's slow to anger, abounding in mercy, he will not always chide, and things of that order. And in the New Testament, you get all of these passages on hell, most of which come from Jesus' lips,
Right.
and horrific depictions of hell at the end of Revelation 14 and passages of that
That's
order.
correct.
And so far from saying that when you move from the Old Testament to the New, you move from wrath to grace, I think it's truer to say that when you move from the Old Testament to the New, you ratchet up the pictures of God's love so that the high point of the depiction of God's love is what happens at the cross. But you also ratchet up the depictions of God's wrath, and the high point of the depiction of God's wrath happens at the cross. So it's
That's
as
right.
if both of these themes are pummeling through Scripture, and they ratchet up and they ratchet up and they ratchet up, and there's no resolution whatsoever until you get to the cross. And what flows out of the cross in heaven and hell is merely a reflection of the outflow of what Christ achieved on the cross. And so you don't want to sound condemnatory or angry when you deal with a passage like Joshua 8, but you've got to put it within the canonical sweep and bring the congregation to Jesus.
That's right. Nor do you want to sound like you're sitting in judgment on God.
That's right.
And isn't it true that I think the modern mind is much more preoccupied with the mode of death than we are with what happens after death?
That's true.
Whether those people in Ai die at the end of an Israelite spear or dying of old age at home in bed, if hell is what awaits the other side, that is the real issue.
Yes.
And
canonically, that's right.
That's correct. And so we point to what God does with His Son. If you have a problem with Joshua 8, you're going to have a real problem with what God does with Jesus when He takes Him outside the city wall.
And it has a bearing on how we see, how we help people. It has a bearing on, Christians have always been at the forefront of let's say, medical help in Africa or digging wells in the Sahel and so on. I remember reading a learned atheist who said that Africa would be in a far, far, far worse state that if it had not been for the Christian missionaries who built most of the hospitals in the first place and still in many cases staff them. One Ebola expert said that Ebola would have escaped the bounds that constrained it were it not for medical missionaries and things of that order. It is right that we should remember those things. But on the other hand, it is also easy to talk about bringing bread to the hungry and clean water to those who don't have it and medicine to those who need it and so on. It's right that we should do those things. But if you do those things and do not warn people of the wrath to come and present the good news of Jesus, I like what John Piper says. It's because you don't love them very much.
Right.
That is, you love them enough to help them for a few decades here in time, but you don't love them enough to care for them for all eternity.
That's right.
And that's really sad.
Adrian Rogers used to say, "You're just making the earth a better place to go to hell from."
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
You've helped in pastors and others in so many ways, but one thing, you were instrumental in the creation of the Gospel Coalition. Yes. Which is, I think, certainly a major force in evangelicalism. Now, is it true that you and Tim Keller came up with this idea? Where did it come from?
It began in a walk in Manhattan in 2002.
I love stories like this.
Yeah.
That we take to the moment and the place, and an idea begins.
Tim and I had not met until fairly late. We'd worked together on a couple of projects. The book Worship by the Book, for example, I had conscripted him, but we hadn't met face to face. We first met at an EMA conference, Evangelical Ministers Assembly in London, and we were both on the speaking docket, and we clicked. Some people do, and sort of sit around and sort out all the world's problems and look around for another world, and it was that kind of friendship. So I was in Princeton doing something or other and took the train into New York City. And both of us had been thinking independently about the the desirability of having a central institution or organ or the like that encapsulated the best of confessional, broadly reformed, biblically based Christianity. And there had been other attempts to do that sort of thing. ACE, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, had tried,
Right.
But for various reasons it didn't work out too well. And which is not a criticism of the men at the time. It was partly the time, partly the place. But we weren't convinced it was doable, and we weren't sure it needed to be done, but we thought it should be explored. So we began by talking to our friends in our various circles and saying who should be invited to a consideration of these things. And we looked for senior pastors. We wanted pastors, not scholars, because they ask a different set of questions. So pastor scholars, fine, but they had to be pastors. Number two, they had to be expositors. Number three, they had to be broadly reformed. Number four, they had to be committed to evangelism with something of a track record in that regard. I don't mean a track record necessarily in terms of numbers, but in terms of being committed to unpacking what the gospel really is. Number five, they had to be from different parts of the country and different denominations. And number six, they had to be from different races. It couldn't be just a white man's club. So those are the criteria that we had to begin with. And we invited 40 pastors. None of us in the room knew all 40. We first met on the Trinity campus in 2005. And going in, there was a lot of suspicion. But we were already convinced this was of God. We invited 40 people, and every single one of the 40 came.
Wow.
That just doesn't happen.
No, that doesn't.
And that included, people like John Piper and Mark Dever and people whose names you would know, and Lig Duncan and others. And we spent half to 2/3 of our time, that first time, listening to one another, learning one another's stories, and praying for one another. That's all we did. We listened and prayed. There were only 2 formal presentations, one by Tim, one by me, one outlining where we'd come from, and number 2 outlining possible ways ahead. That's all we did. Then we brainstormed for a while and got no farther after 3 days than agreeing that one of us would write a statement of faith and the other a theological vision of ministry, and we'd come back the next year and see if we were in agreement on enough points to actually put an organization together. And they all came back the next year. And we argued about those things paragraph by paragraph, line by line, gradually whipped them into shape. And by 2007, we ran our first conference. And just on Trinity's Chapel, word of mouth, a bit of internet advertising, the chapel held 600 and was packed out. But we noticed that about 75 or 80% were under the age of 40.
Something was happening.
Something was happening.
When did the website begin?
In the wake of the 2007 thing, we appointed our first staff member and started the site. It began in a primitive way, 2007, 2008, I'm not sure which. And by this time we had some idea of what we would like to do, but to talk about all the things that we're doing today and the worldwide impact and the regionalization and the literature and all the stuff that's free and the current budget and so on, we hadn't got that far. What we wanted to do was to strengthen churches in handling the Word of God, encouraging expository material, really good books and articles and podcasts and so on that would model things well, and all of it free to the end user. Which decision meant that our business model had to accommodate that.
Yeah.
And the Lord raised up the money.
Yeah, free stuff is a hard business model.
It is a hard business model.
Yeah, but you've done amazing. Is it safe to say that it's gone beyond what you originally envisioned?
Yes, our sites are visited today by about 35 million different people per annum.
That's amazing.
And we have sites correspondingly in French and German and Chinese and other languages, and they're all linked in one fashion or another. The Spanish site is growing 30 or 40% a year,
it continues to have a major impact.
It does.
I am so grateful for it. This time with you has been wonderful. Here to round out our conversation, I'd like to engage you in what I call the twinkling of an eye round, and just ask some quick questions, and then we will be done. Is that all right?
Sure.
All right. What preacher most influenced you?
Might be a quick answer, but I don't know how to do these, which is the best of these or the worst.
That's okay.
Because different preachers influenced me at different times. There was a time when I listened assiduously to John Stott, and so he influenced me. But I listened to Lloyd Jones. I got to know him pretty well. There was a time when I listened to Stephen Olford.
He was a dear friend of mine.
Yeah.
Did you ever listen to Barnhouse much?
No, recordings, but I didn't really know him.
Oh.
But Stephen Olford actually preached at the seminary that I studied at on my graduation, and I quickly became exposed to a lot of preachers, and I've come to the conclusion that if you listen to one preacher for 50 or 60 sermons, you become a bad clone.
Mm-hmm.
You listen to two preachers, 25 sermons each, and you become confused. You listen to 50 preachers, 5 or 10 sermons each, and you learn different good things from all of them and become your own voice.
I believe so too.
So I'm not simply in the footsteps of one person. It's just not the way I think.
I understand. I appreciate that. What's your favorite work of fiction? You read any fiction?
I read quite a lot of fiction.
Do you have a favorite?
No,
What is something you've read recently or something you like? Fiction.
Some historical fiction, things that are grounded, things that are either history or something, an historical novel that is not too far from the truth.
Gotcha.
In World War II, certain periods of history that interest me. I read some whodunits, but I also read some Shakespeare. I like poetry.
You have a favorite poet or a favorite category of poetry? Period?
There's some poetry I just don't like. I can only take blank verse in small doses, and then by real masters like Robert Frost.
Uh-huh.
For the 1800s, Elizabeth Barrett Browning is superb. Her poem "Cooper's Grave" is outstanding, and her love poems on the Portuguese are simply brilliant.
I agree. Do you write with music playing or in silence?
Silence.
Do you watch much? Do you watch Netflix, Amazon Prime, anything like streaming video?
We don't have Netflix. I've watched maybe one thing on Amazon Prime. I have it, but I don't use it.
No, I was curious about that. I was just seeing how much you would use technology in like personal viewing habits.
No, the technology I use is bound up with Gospel Coalition work, or
Gotcha.
It's bound up with Greek Testament work. I use Nota Bene, and I helped to develop Graham Chord, and so the Mac version of it, Accordance, comes out of that. So it's not that I'm technologically
I understand.
completely clueless, but on the other hand,
you're very focused.
I'm more focused.
Yeah,
and
I see.
I don't like to be entertained.
Do you have a favorite vacation spot?
Several. My wife and I have 6 or 7 times gone to the Lake District in England and walked, hill walking in the Lake District. We love the geography. We love the walking. So we've done other things, but for our 40th anniversary, the notion of taking a cruise in the Caribbean turns both of us off. We don't like the heat, and just stuck on a boat that doesn't turn us on at all. But for our 40th anniversary, 4 or 5 years ago, we took an Alaska cruise, and with pauses to see bear and whales and wildlife and the flowers of Australia, of Alaska and so on.
And you've been married how many years now?
We were married in 75, so this is our 44th coming up.
Do you discuss your sermons with your wife after you preach them? Do you ask her opinion?
Rarely. No. If she doesn't like something, she'll tell me. No.
Is she gentle, or is she straight to the point?
She's straight to the point.
Oh.
Temperamentally, she what you see is what you get, which I'd just as soon have in any case.
I understand. What would you advise your 20-year-old self?
Grow up.
Well, I think you've succeeded in that. I think your 20-year-old self has listened to you. I can't thank you enough for what you've meant to me personally, for what you've meant to a generation of Christians and seminary students and professors and preachers. God has richly blessed us with you. I'm grateful for your life and ministry, Dr. Carson, and thank you for being with me here today on Pastor Well.
Thank you, Dr. York. I'm profoundly grateful to you and your leadership.
I want to thank you for tuning in to Pastor Well. You've made our first season very successful. Thank you for listening. Thank you for telling others about it. I hope you'll continue to share it. And look forward to season 2. We've got a lot of great guests coming up, and that'll be coming out in a few weeks. But in the meantime, if you would like to know more about studying at Southern Seminary, why don't you come to our preview day on October the 18th? You can find out more about it by going to sbts.edu/preview. Register there. You can come, stay in the Legacy Center, meet professors, and tour the campus, sit in a classroom, see what God is doing here at Southern Seminary that will equip you to pastor well.